All right, doing a film study here about Aidan Hutchinson. I want to talk about his quote-unquote worst game. A lot of people talked about how, yes, he was incredible this season, but I've heard some of his detractors say he got relatively shut down against Georgia, which was the biggest game of the year for Michigan. That was their playoff game that they lost, and because of that, did not make it to the championship. So, if you're a believer in that an edge rusher is the most important position or one of the most important positions in football, you certainly don't want to see him get shut down and the defense lit up in that game. Well, I would kind of push back on that a little and say, listen, one guy can only do so much, right? An edge rusher, I think that if guys are getting open, only so much you can do. That's inherently going to be a part of it. But, I do think this was one of his worser games. So if we're just going to look at his PFF grades, again, I know PFF grades are always, there's always a powder keg of, people that like PFF grades, people that hate PFF grades. I think they're solid. They're not perfect, but they give you a pretty good idea. You look at his numbers, and his numbers overall were fine, but this was definitely one of his worser games. 70.9 was his overall defensive grade. Run defense a little bit better, tackling a little bit better. Pass rush definitely on the lower side, 62.7. This was one of his, if not his worst game in his college career. So yeah, it is fair to say this was one of his worser games. These still aren't abysmal numbers. He was very consistent last year, but still, if he played like this every game, you wouldn't be talking about him as a potential number 1 overall pick who ended up going number 2 to Detroit. But let's watch some film, and let's start off with something like this. So I paused it right here, so that's why you're not seeing anything happen. But the reason why I wanted to start off with this play is the first thing I noticed is that this was the vast majority of what we saw Georgia do. Maybe vast majority is too harsh, but this is a ton of what we saw Georgia do, which is something like this. As you see, this is just going to be a quick pass to, a quick screen pass where there's nothing Hutchinson could have done there. And that does a couple of things. A, it takes Hutchinson out of the play. B, it worked. Like, that was an effective play right there. That was a 3rd down and 11, and you still got a 15-yard gain. So that was definitely a very key play. And finally, the third thing that it does is that it just tires out Hutchinson. They made these throws a lot of times in Hutchinson's direction, which just sort of forced him to then have to turn around and run back to chase after a wide receiver. And he's just, you're getting him gassed. You're getting him tired. That's a good strategic decision they did. So this was part of why you're going to see the numbers not quite as good. This was a part of it. I also, when I went back and watched this game, saw stuff like this, where this was just kind of a weird thing that I didn't see Michigan do hardly at all last year. I watched every snap of Hutchinson's during my evaluation of all the new players who are about to get drafted, and I almost never saw him getting used like this, where watch what's going to happen here. Watch him kind of drop back into coverage, and then he's going to go on a delayed blitz, and, the pass got thrown quickly. That ended up being a touchdown. Just kind of a weird decision, especially when Georgia was getting rid of the football so quickly that Hutchinson, a delayed blitz, by the time he even started to rush the passer, the ball was already thrown, so there's nothing he could have done there. And I also think that, you're taking your best edge rusher and not having him try to just beat a tackle one-on-one, which he can do a pretty decent job of. I get it. You're down a lot in the fourth quarter. You're trying to make something happen. So I understood the logic behind it, but I saw some of this. It wasn't a huge deal. I'm not going to completely make excuses for him about that, but this was also a real factor. And finally, I do want to say, I did see him get some wins. He got some losses, for sure. He did get beat, which happens, but I did see him, I think, get some wins as well that just didn't come into fruition. So the way this play is working is it's actually going to be kind of a blitz, which means that the guard and the tackle, one of them has to decide who's going to, block Hutchinson. And I think what Hutchinson does so well is he is so explosive. So watch how right when this play begins, you do see how he's able to kind of squeeze in between both of them. He works so well in that, little space, and he is so explosive that he is able to get in between them, which again, we know Hutchinson's good, all of that stuff. The issue, of course, at this point is that with a quarterback starting to run to the other side of the field, there's just only so much Hutchinson can do. As you see, Hutchinson actually gets over and creates a pressure. What happens? Well, the quarterback scrambles out and picks up a first down right there. So you made the right play, you did the right thing, and you got a pressure. It just didn't matter. And I saw some of those as well. So yes, there's some truth to the fact that he didn't have a great game against Georgia, but I think that the idea that he got completely shut down or just was trash in this game is untrue. He had a fine game, which by his standards is not good enough. He does need to be better, but that's kind of how I viewed it. One statistic that I just find kind of funny is that even despite this being his worst game and like his PFF grade not being as good, this was still better than all but 3 of Trayvon Walker's games last year, according to PFF grades. So even his worst game is still, that kind of quality, and it was better than Trayvon Walker just on an average day in general. So that's also kind of what we're dealing with a little bit here. Listen, I didn't think it was his best game. He had 31 pass rush snaps. It's a small sample size. When you look at certain games, you are going to have some worse games. And when you factor on, at least half of those were plays where he was just never going to have an impact whatsoever, he might have only had 10 to 15 actual snaps where he could just straight up rush the passer. So because of that, it was really weird for me to say, like, oh, yeah, he got shut down. Like, no, he didn't. Georgia had a great game plan to attack the Michigan defense and to have a lot of really good talented players who can get open quickly, which at that point, there's not a lot you can do if you are Hutchinson. To me, that's a lot more of what I saw about it. So this is a narrative I've seen a decent amount with Hutchinson. I've seen it more on Twitter. I can never really tell, like, I think an expression is Twitter is not real life, because a lot of the narratives that you'll see on Twitter aren't actual, like, true things that people believe sometimes. Sometimes they're just people like to argue and people have fun on that. So that's what they do on Twitter, which, that might be the case. But I do feel like there's some people that have at least brought it up as not his best game, which again is true, but it's one game where he didn't have that many, pass rush snaps just because, he was run defending a lot. And even some of the pass rush snaps were just like screen passes, where not a lot you can do there either. So while there's truth to it, like most things, there is truth to these narratives, but there's also more nuance than that, and it's not so simple. So I think that if you're saying, oh, he might be someone who doesn't show up in the big games, for one thing, I've just never heard of that being in a case of an edge rusher, like, ever. Like, I've never heard once that there's an edge rusher who, like, crumbles under pressure. I don't think that's really possible, just because it's such a physical sport. It seems like, for the most part, you only crumble if you're going up against a good tackle. And, better competition you go up against, you're going to play worse, which, might have happened a little bit in Georgia. I didn't think it was, like, an amazing competition in terms of the offensive line there, but maybe you could argue that's the case. But as a whole, that's kind of how I view most of that. So again, the, thing that we know is obviously very true, which is that Aidan Hutchinson is good at football. That's not really a question. We know that that's the case. I do think that, again, part of what it might just be is more people watch the Georgia game. And when you get more people watching the Georgia game, narratives become bigger. Narratives become bigger when more people are watching a specific game. I've noticed just doing this channel during the playoffs, you get a lot more hot takes, and you get a lot more kind of sweeping generalizations during certain things, because you have more fans, more eyeballs on it. So it becomes like a confirmation bias thing. Someone says something, another person kind of says, oh yeah, that is true, and then it snowballs there, and you just get more casual fans there. And there was some truth to it, right? Like, that's the other aspect. I'm not trying to sit here and say it wasn't true. Like, he probably should have been better in that game. I would have been disappointed if I was a Michigan fan and that's how he played. I wouldn't have been, like, devastated. I wouldn't have been mad at him, and I wouldn't have called him a choker for it, and I certainly wouldn't have held it against him in terms of his draft stock. I think that's insane to hold it against him in front of in his draft stock. But I would have been like, oh man, this is a really important game, and usually you're a little bit better than this. And he was only good. Like, again, a plus 70 PFF grade, that's a good college grade. Like, that's like a quality college grade. You wouldn't draft someone who does that in college, but that's still an above average game. So because of that, and again, I know PFF grades, people don't care about that so much. People want sacks, right? Which is not really the best way to evaluate pass rush, in my opinion. But that's just kind of how I view all this. So yeah, I want to make just kind of a quick video talking about this stuff. What do you guys think about all of this? Let me know in the comments below. What are your thoughts on Aidan Hutchinson's quote-unquote worst game? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.